Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Sarah. This is Betsy Hill. I'm President and Chief Operating Officer of Learning Enhancement Corporation, and we're delighted to have you all joining us for today's Neuroscience and Education webinar on what teachers don't know about neuroscience. And our presenter today is Dr. Tammy Shepherd. Tammy received her bachelor's degree in secondary science education, a master's degree in educational psychology, and her doctorate in administrative leadership. She tells me she has 29 years of experience as a teacher, a counselor, and an administrator in schools in Texas, although but I reckon that must have made her somewhere about 10 years old when she started teaching, so maybe they start them early in Texas. But she's been trained by Dr. Pat Wolf as a trainer of trainers on brain-compatible teaching, and she currently educates others as an adjunct professor at Wayland Baptist University and as an independent provider of professional development on a number of topics, including the adolescent brain, early brain development, developing the reading brain, and brain-compatible teaching for teachers of science, as well as other subjects. She has a ton of energy, a great sense of humor, and an absolutely charming accent. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tammy.
Thank you so much, Betsy, for that lovely introduction. I am so glad to be here to be able to share what it is I found out through my research as I went through the doctoral process. As a longtime educator, longtime counselor and administrator, the more I learned about how the brain learns, the more I realized that this is really what I believe to be key to being able to be successful in our schools. So I'd like to share with you today what I have from my research, what I have in some of the workshops that I present across the country, and just some of the information that is kind of confusing teachers sometimes as we go through and share this information. Neuroeducation is a relatively new term, coined probably about 5 years ago. There's a wonderful institution called the IMBD, International Mind, Brain, and Education. And it is just absolutely cutting edge as we're trying to incorporate cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and educational pedagogy, which people probably thought is already happening. But these are three different, very distinctive fields. And what's happening is they've all kind of gone on their own way. And then they realized, we all should have some form of overlap to be able to help students to learn. And this emerging field is getting a lot of attention lately. So it's emerging in the halls of academia. My pursuit in my doctoral study was just where does this stand with teachers in the classroom? So we know from research background that for teaching to occur at the higher levels, and that's what all of the testing is starting to measure, and to be applied in new contexts and situations, we have to incorporate that vastly expanding knowledge that includes neuroscience. And the bulk of the teachers in our country have not experienced training in any kind of neuroscience or cognitive science. And as it becomes available, we're going to have to use this to change the way teachers teach and the way students learn. And so if we're evolving as an educational system, we really need to be aware of what it is that is going to help people to be able to learn their best. Just some basic background before I begin going into all of this. What the brain seeks is different depending on different research, but we know that patterns are important. We know that novelty, anything that's a little contrary to what is expected. The brain is very determined to find meaning, questions. Community is essential. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but as a human society, we must have community. That's non-negotiable for us to be a whole and well person. And not only activity by ourselves, but participating in activities through that community. Security is paramount as well as recognition. These are things that we know the brain seeks. So how do we turn these into some way to to be able to help teachers to be able to develop ways of teaching all levels and being lifelong learners with what the brain does best. And when we talk about what the brain does best, what I'm meaning is what it's hardwired to do. Just take a moment, if you will, and look at this picture. Typical picture, bowl, vegetables, English looking, whatever it might be. But when this is turned over, you see something very different. Our brains are hardwired to see faces. So in fact, what this means is it is undeniable that our brain pays attention to seeing that face. We have to play upon this hardwiring in the classroom to be able to get students pay attention to what it is. And using little ways that their brains are hardwired to be able to watch. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there are no magic pills that we can try to get installed, but this is just part of our process of learning how the brain learns best. Another thing is nobody's brains are the same. Everybody's brain is filtered by experience. Hopefully your brain will have evolved and changed a little bit after the experience in this webinar. But we know that no students, no two people bring the same experiences to the same place. So this is an organ in our system that is shaped by experience. We call this plasticity. It's a feature that lasts throughout our lifetime. But young brains are much more plastic than adult brains. And as the brain is evolving, it is schools that are entrusted to shape young brains. Through the academic, often the social, many needs are being met. And so there's a large burden on the schools. Doing this, we need to be able to work smarter instead of harder. I mean, we're all working as hard as we can. So this is where my research kind of took flight. The actual title of my research is Middle School Educator Perceptions of Neuroeducation. I wanted to go into a middle school and find out just what teachers knew and thought they knew and used in the classroom setting that was compatible with neuroeducation. Current research is showing that there is new findings that are able to increase memory and learning and greatly enhance teacher process. And with all this wonderful stuff out there, who knows how much the teachers know? And if we're going to develop staff development, professional development, teacher enhancement skills, it is imperative that we know where they are. Just like when we do pre-assessment with students, we have to know the strengths and the gaps to be able to identify where it is we want to go with this information. So I wanted to find out what knowledge teachers possess in the field of neuroscience. I'll explain to you as we go forward, but we identified some common themes and meanings, and were able to obtain some baseline data that was very revealing and very startling to me and my committee as we kind of explored this. When I looked at the background literature, people who were kind of studying what was going on in the classroom, some quotes that kind of spoke to me were Tracy Takahama Espinosa, who is leading brain-based educational research in Colombia. She talks about concepts from neuroeducation have been applied indiscreetly and inconsistently in classroom practice for many years, and that there's a need to research this process of translating neuroscience and cognitive theories into educational practice. And I think it's really important that we realize where we are so that we can find out where it is we want to be. So, as I'm going through this and looking, I realized that there's important things that we have to find out what neuroeducation is, but then all of a sudden it occurred to me that we needed to also find out what neuroeducation is not, because there's a lot of misconceptions and misbeliefs. I'll start out with how I developed my background information through the chapter that kind of led us to be able to say these are the things we know to be neuroeducation, tested through science, and there are some things, of course, that may or may not be, which have not been completely tested yet, and then there'll be some things that are definitely not neuroeducation. I think it's really important to bear in mind that it's very difficult to do studies on students because, or people in general, because you can't deprive one group of it to have your control group and then try your practice on another in many of the instances when we're trying to educate everybody. My research was done through interviews and coding those interviews. But my background information was just kind of a compilation. What I did is called a typological study, where you establish the canons before you go in and do their interviews, and that way you compare the interviews to the canons. I was able to take the conglomerate of information and do what I think is kind of a fun way of being able to remember what is brain research, and that's building an acronym out of it. Our brains love a little novelty. They love the acronym. So let me share with you how I've kind of put it down to remember it, and then we'll go through the different points. We've got listed down on the left-hand column the acronym BRAINS, B-R-A-I-N-S. B is background knowledge, R is the reinforcement, A is affect, I inquiry, novelty, and socialization. Scientists have shown that these different categories here are actually able to increase attention and improve memory. And see, that is the thing that we want the brain to do, is to pay attention to whatever it is that we're trying to communicate, and we want to improve everybody's memory. So let's go and start with B, our background knowledge. We know that the brain is always seeking meaningful patterns, and our species didn't survive by taking in meaningless information. You know, I think now it's pretty common that people understand the brain is not like the old sponge model we used to use as our metaphor, but more like a sieve. And you can pour it in, and only certain things will get caught in the strain. And it's really important that we realize that something has got to make the brain attend to a detail in order for it to have a chance of being remembered, and then memory can work from there. But every encounter with something new requires the brain to fit the new information into an existing category. And these are neural paths. If there is not a neural connection to go to, something to hang that bit of information on, the information just drops. It's in and out. And that's why building on background knowledge is going to help us have hooks that we can hang a tidbit more of information on as we slowly approximate getting closer to the concepts we want to teach. What students already know is one of the strongest indicators of how well they will master new content. And this background knowledge really was one of the driving forces behind my research, because I thought, okay, so what teachers already know is one of the strongest indicators of how well they'll master new information. And I found that there was not a lot of information that the teachers knew. So this is very important to realize that we must establish the background. Robert Marzano is just a whiz at background information. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, very much aligned with how the brain works best. And just a wealth of information out there. Associations can be made with other information, and we have to hook new concepts and terms to previous learning. That is the B in brain. The next is reinforcement or repeat. There's going to be a lot that goes on as we review, reinforce, reflect, repeat. And the more frequently our neural connections are used, the stronger they become. Often when talking to people who are familiar with brain-based education or brain-compatible learning, we talk about neurons that are wired together, fire together, or fire together, wire together, sorry. And so it's really important that we realize that those practicing reinforcement must take place. To get from the into the working memory depends on the multiple times that a detail is added. Our brains are poorly designed to be able to get big ideas at once. We must use repeated exposure and pre-exposure. We know this to be true. And I often suggest to teachers to practice summarizing lessons with class to make it part of a classroom routine. It's really hard to realize, but we're going 100 miles an hour in the classroom. We're hoping to bestow all this grand information onto our classroom, and they're willingly looking at us. And to summarize and pull some conclusions sometimes requires a lot of effort. But without that re-exposure and that summarizing right there at the end, information just goes, like they say, in one ear and out the other. So it's important to learn that information that goes in one ear and out the other is not learned. And it is worth the time to be able to stop and be able to summarize at the end. A for affect, and this is emotions. This is how we're feeling, and this is extremely important as we're looking at it. As we're looking at brain-based things, educators constantly interact with students and their emotions, maybe sometimes to the point of it being extremely draining, extremely uplifting. There is no way to separate learning from emotion. So we need to be able to embrace that and realize that it can be used as a tool to help teachers to be able to be more successful in the classroom. But one thing I think we all know is that emotions always take priority over everything else. If a student's having a meltdown, it's really hard to get them convinced that the quadratic equation is imperative, no matter how many tests are going to keep them from graduating. Our brain is wired that emotions always will take priority. And so that is just part of what we need to know so that we can use that in our toolkit to become good teachers. There are two big attention getters, emotion being one of them, and then the second one being novelty. Emotions are more powerfully determining behavior than any logic or rational thought. And our innate emotions are going to be the ones that the brain triggers. We teach students and our families to be able to have secondary emotions. Our innate response might be fear, but we show sadness. That is a more developed affect system. Pride is a powerful emotion, and rewards are not brain compatible because the brain perceives the not receiving the reward as punishment. So we need to remember it's okay to recognize, it's okay to celebrate, but when there is some kind of a tangible reward accompanying a behavior, not getting that reward will be perceived as punishment. And so as all of these things are taking place, if we're in a classroom and there's a spider in the classroom, or somebody's suddenly making a lot of noise out in the hall, or somebody's irritatingly tapping on the desk, the brain will over-respond many times if they sense a potential danger. If a mouse runs across the room in your classroom, the students will over-respond, jump, and run. Not because they're trying to be theatrical, just because that is how the brain is wired. And then having to calm them down and get them back is part of what we all do when we're in the classroom. But at the same time, I think that teachers have to realize that this is just part of what it is that makes us human. Dental care can add lifespan, and no matter how old you are, and too much stress can reduce their ability to learn. And there's a fine line there between challenge and stress. We have to always be monitoring this. There's a lot to be done as teachers that we know that the brain responds to, and with everybody having a different brain, we are further charged with being able to balance these things. So I just want to kind of let you know that there's no answer. There's no definite thing. There's as many ways that we must be able to think about situations differently. The eye and brain, for my research is inquiry. There's a connection between emotion and problem solving, and it triggers attention and curiosity. And the innate curiosity that we really need to find within youngsters is just something that is marvelous to educators. When something piques your curiosity, the brain will attend to it. And it's really great to formulate questions. A lot of times I suggest even assigning questions rather than answers in classrooms, using what and why questions that target thinking. Reference for this, the work of Art Costa, I think it might be Arthur Costa, is just phenomenal when it comes to inquiry. We have to be able to continue building upon the curiosity that is so innate. Students that get older often are accused of checking out and not being curious, but if you were to watch them with something that does pique their interest, whether they're on the golf team or whether they're doing an FFA project or whatever it might be, the things that interest them will charge their curiosity. And I think it's great that we can go and put things that will kind of challenge the mind. I'm hoping that if you first looked at this picture here, your brain went kind of like, what? And that is the attention and the feeling that happens when something doesn't logically connect in the brain. You have to pay attention to it. We're hardwired to that. It's also a good time, I think, to mention that we've got frontal lobes growing with our students. As this frontal cortex is starting to develop, there's been a lot of discussion about how adults, even into young adulthood, are starting to get the reasoning part of their brain. This has got to be taken into account also as we work with students. This is the part of our brain that processes ambiguity, metaphor, abstract thinking, patterns, and it's changing. And all of the time, we're confronting students with questions and we're creating concepts for them to understand. And we have to be mindful that for them to be able to produce higher levels of thinking, that we have to be very developmentally appropriate with them, which connects that cognitive psychology back into our world. One of the difficulties we can need to be aware of as we're pushing for this is that there's a chance for overgeneralization in young minds. They see things, and so we have to be mindful of that as well. Once again, so much of a balancing act. Novelty is just absolutely critical in so many ways. If we were to look at this is what I think many people have seen. It's just kind of a fun poster, and the purpose of this is you're supposed to read the word. So I would go yellow, blue, red, purple, green, as fast as you can. And it's very difficult sometimes to not say the color and to get mixed up. Our brains are dominated by vision. Learning to read is not an innate process, so as a result it can become very difficult. People are drawn to doing fun things like this because there's a novelty about it. Here's another one. This is called Which Came First, the Chicken or the Egg? And these are just fun little pictures that sometimes people share. What I want to speak to with this is there's kind of an ambiguity that happens here. We see the fried egg, we see the chicken, and the reason that we're not sure exactly what it is there are neural pathways competing to be able to create that pathway. And when these pathways are competing, our brain isn't really sure which way to figure it out. Ambiguity is not a bad thing for us to have. It's actually a very good for instruction if it's monitored and not overly ambiguous. So as I said before, it's the second biggest attention getter, but active participation encourages brain growth. Music, talk, speaking are all very successful. But once again, here's the neuroeducational paradox. The more often you use a novel strategy, the less novel it becomes. So we have to be mindful too. If students are able to do patterns over and over and you throw in something a little different, then it gets to be second nature to recognize that difference. My last part of brains is socialization. We are social creatures. We don't have claws. We don't have extremely fast abilities to run. Our human survival has come because of community. We have been able to depend on each other to learn and to grow together. And this social nature, as I'm calling it, is just as much a brain function as memory and language. So students are in the classroom isolated with their little folded manila folders for their, sometimes teachers call them their office. They're focused in their little carousel, only doing stuff by themselves. This is really disregarding a big part of what the brain needs to be able to function. And these social forces can enhance or undermine the learning forces. I think we often speak to bullying on this fact. If social forces are undermining a student and they are feeling this bullying, there's absolutely no way they're able to concentrate on any of the learning processes. Let's take a minute, please, and talk about what we call neuromyths. Neuromyths are the things, the ideas that have been put out there, and their really misconceptions are not quite right. They're premature application of neuroscience to education, and it has created widespread acceptance of some ideas that have no scientific validation. And so part of my quest of being able to do this is to see what kinds of things were actually believed that were misinformation. I put a few on here. There are many on there, but like the brains don't start out as a blank slate. We aren't born not being able to know or do anything. We're starting out with a lot more neural activity than what's thought. And you're not born with all the neurons you'll ever have. We have found now that the brain is making these neurons. It was popular for Wall to think that there were critical periods for learning. We're finding that this is absolutely not the case. What we have found is that there are maybe sensitive periods like language development. After about 12-month-old or so, we lose the ability to make some sounds in languages, but there's no neurological ground supporting the importance of this the first 3 years. Now, except, and there's always the exception, and that's going to be an extreme deprivation. And we need to really realize, too, that there are outliers to many things because the brains are so different. I know many people have said that 10% of the brain is all we use, and we know that that is definitely far from being the truth. A popular misconception out there in the world of schools is that some people are more right brain and some are left brain learners. There is no scientific validity to this. The brain is constantly working in parallel fashion. Yeah, sometimes we do learn more with the right part of our brain or the left part. But then as that learning is assimilated into working memory, it goes and it'll be stored in an exactly opposite hemisphere. So another thing is there's been no research to show that this is helpful for learning or teaching. I want to share with you this part of our learning process. VAK is a huge buzzword, I guess you could say, in the education protocols. It does engage and support the learner, but there is no brain research that shows that we have a preference for visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. And there is brain research that shows that visual will trump every time. Howard Garner runs a wonderful institute and bringing a lot of brain neuroeducation in, and he advocates that his multiple intelligence is completely overgeneralized, and it was based on psychology, not neuroscience, totally different fields with some overlapping. And then many teachers believe that students need an enriched environment, but we find these can be overstimulating. And something that some of the old school teachers still swear by, Memorization is necessary for complex mental processes. We must get through that. So what I found from my interviews with these teachers and the coding of the transcripts was that the middle school teachers had a gap in basic knowledge of neuroeducation. Most of them believed that knowledge of how the brain learns was a great asset. But then when I said, for example, very few could articulate any concrete knowledge or examples of what they had done. The school had done some research with Marzano, so prior knowledge was something that came up. And 70% of the participants talked about reinforcement. It was very interesting, though, I found that teachers, three of the teachers actually said that dealing with emotions in the classroom was a distractor from the content, and they felt it was a detriment to the students behaviorally. And novelty wasn't exactly mentioned by anyone specifically, but when they shared anecdotal data, I could tell that teachers understood the value of the novelty. It seemed like the older teachers were more reluctant to do social learning. And when talking about social, two of the teachers actually thought that meant interactions between teacher and student, like saying, "Good morning, how are you? I'm glad you're here." But we're talking really about a social working group collaborative activity that helps students to learn together. And then there were also actually 20% of our people in this study were leery of using any kind of social interaction. All of this being said, sometimes it's just not having access to information. But what I was very astonished by is that everyone, 100% of the interviewees, shared information perceived by them to be neurologically sound. They thought it was good, but it had been disproven by top neuroeducational research. So they were actually in the classroom working, thinking they were working for the good of students, trying hard to incorporate right brain, left brain, VAK. The types of learning, those were the two most prevalent that teachers were trying to use. And we know that there is no impact on helping the learning process. Another teacher was trying to use physical activity, trying to teach them when there's an adjective, you touch your head, and when it's an adverb, you touch your elbow, things like this. Just such a distortion of things that have been said in the past, but the teachers were still trying their best to do something different. I was extremely surprised during this century here in the 2000s to see that gender differences were still believed to exist. People believing that boys were better, in fact, at math and science. They've done some big studies. I think one out of the University of Michigan with over 20,000 people and found that there is actually no data to support that. So the teachers not having the information about what is and is not brain-compatible learning, neuroeducationally sound information, I needed to find out what attitudes or barriers there were. And the main reason teachers gave for not acquiring knowledge about how the brain learns best, time. And we know that it's a very demanding field, and we know that they work hard. But time was the number one factor that teachers were not continuing to learn. Discipline was a concern. Teachers were afraid if they were to give up a little bit, that would start to become a problem for them. 70% had said time in my study. 30% believed that discipline would be an obstacle that would keep them from trying these practices. I was a little bit surprised with the third finding. That was a lack of confidence in their own ability to understand neuroeducation. There was a significant number of teachers that viewed just the word neuroeducation put them aback, and they didn't think that they would be able to learn it, having a fear of science, a fear of the unknown. And I think in my mind, these are people who already have college degrees. They can learn this, and they will be very pleased as they do. And I was disappointed to learn that some people thought that neuroeducation was an addition to the curriculum, when actually we know it's a delivery method that enhances and increases retention of the curriculum. And understanding that, I think, is something that is going to have to be addressed by people who are leaders in this field. So as I was saying, we found a significant gap, and there was an overwhelming amount of information believed to be factual, but characterized by researchers as normal. When I asked the question about what strategies do educators believe to be successful or unsuccessful, the main one they said was prior learning, novelty, VAK, and right brain, left brain. Unsuccessful, they thought, would be social interactions because of misbehavior. But when I asked them what they thought would be unsuccessful, every single one of them said none of them would be, believing all neuroeducationally supported ones would be successful. But yet I see a hesitance for them to try this. So sometimes I kind of contributed that to maybe them wanting to say the right thing and to be a good teacher, to be kind of a pleaser, if you will, trying to find the right answers more than just the real answer. Listen within time and belief that the science behind it is too complicated to be understood. With these disconnects, I'd like to be able to share some information with you that might be able to help us to know where we can go from here. Professional development is going to be important. Without professional development, we cannot expect teachers to change. I'm very surprised at how little neuroeducationally based information is in our schools of education and the university level. This puts the burden onto school districts to be able to provide this. Teachers need adequate background knowledge in each of these canons. And then while we're doing the professional development, we need to model quality lessons using these neuroeducational approaches, allow time for processing and application, address the neuromyths, and support them as we go along. I think that it's really important for us to realize that this isn't doing more. This is really kind of taking a time to be able to say, how can I craft my skills, hone my skills to be able to deliver the most impact? And it's such a gray area, or gray matter, because it is so different with every student. But the more we know about it and the more we try to educate others, the more I think that we will find that we can make a difference. And that's kind of a summary of the findings I had from my study, and I was so thrilled to have the opportunity today to share them with your audience, Betsy. If there's some way I can build some neural pathways, I'm more than glad to answer any questions.
Well, it did raise some questions and some thoughts for me, and I can feel my neural pathways being generated even as I speak. So I think you've probably done that. We do now have some time for questions, and Sarah, do we have anybody who has questions can go ahead and type them into the Q&A area or the chat area on the right-hand side of their computer screen, and we will be happy to share those with Tammy and get her observations on those. In the meantime, while we're waiting, we do have some questions.
Oh, sorry.
Great.
We have one that I thought might be a good one for Tammy to talk about. The question comes from Nicole. She wants to know, how did you go about, what methods did you use to collect your baseline information from your teachers?
Okay. the study, Nicole, is one that's called a typological. Hatch is a great person to be able to help you know that he does a lot of qualitative research. And I did this research in one-on-one interviews and then coded it according to the categories that are predetermined. In this kind of research, you find out what the teachers talk about, and then you have to try to code them and see if there's any kind of a disparage between what they talk about and what you're looking for, and then code them. And that's what actually had me create a second, an additional category, which I called obstacles. Teachers were talking so much about the obstacles that hadn't occurred to me as I began my research to think that they were going to talk about them as much as they wanted to talk about the process. But I went to the school. You know, you do all of the paperwork, you get all of your certifications to be able to show that you will do no harm, all the permission from several different levels. It was a multi-month process. And then I had sets of questions, and I just tried to have some candid, honest conversations with teachers about what was going on in their classroom and what kind of information they wanted to share about neuroeducation.
Tammy, do you think that that you know, I know that there's a lot of interest in professional development on sound neuroscience and what it has to tell us about teaching, but would you recommend doing sort of a pre-survey, maybe not quite as elaborately as you did, but surveying teachers in a school before bringing in some professional development, and would it have an impact for the teachers to realize how much inaccurate information they were carrying around?
Yes, I think that would be very powerful. And I would really strongly advise that now, because I didn't realize how much inaccurate information was actually being perpetuated out there. And I think by doing the pre-survey, we're able to target that precious money that we have in the school district to be able to make a inroads and be very specific about where it is. If the teachers already have a grasp of something and they are doing it well, we don't need to spend money to be able to go over that. But we also don't want to overshoot our target and spend money to have something going on that they have no background information to connect it to. And we also need to be so cognizant of how hard teachers are working, that if they are working doing the wrong thing, I think that, that would be hurting their hearts. And we should be able to help channel that in any way possible towards more productive work.
Sarah, do we have other questions?
We do. We have a question about the memorization when you were talking about the VAK and multiple intelligence. She'd like to know how memorization fits into learning.
Well, the more you go across a neural pathway, the thicker that neuron actually becomes. So you don't have to think about it as often to be able to make that connection. In some ways, it's kind of like when you get in your car, turn it on, and start driving to work or driving to a store. You don't have to think about those things because they've become automated. We have to be able to move the information from its raw form and first get the brain to pay attention to it. Second, go to the working memory. And then third, get it into long-term memory. Extremely critical process and very complex. A lot has been written on it. But by being able to repeat and reinforce and get that memory, it goes very quickly. Case in point, and this is a personal bias, not something I've read a lot about, but it's the multiplication tables. There is a generation out there that they believed could use a calculator to do the multiplication tables. And by not having those memorized, it becomes very difficult for those students as they become adults to be able to have some number sets. It is important that basic, concrete level information does become memorized. I'm not saying memorize all the presidents of the United States, but that information that is going to help us to be able to build our higher level thinking skills.
Tammy, are you also talking about the difference between declarative memory and procedural memory, the two kinds of long-term memory? Maybe you could comment a little bit on that, because I think that's related.
I do think it's related, Betsy. That's a very good point, because when we're doing something, that procedural memory kind of takes over, and we're able to do things without having to put the extra attention, energy that attention requires. And when something's out of the ordinary, that becomes our novelty. But when you have procedural memory going in place, you're able to do things. You're able to go and open the microwave, put in your dinner, shut it, turn it on for 3 minutes, and you probably don't even remember doing that. That is a procedural memory. So not only do we need to commit to memory basic concrete facts, which sometimes becomes a skill of reading, sometimes becomes a skill of math, the different concrete things, whatever might apply, a skill of building trades, but we also will commit those procedural memories to a long-term memory, the declarative memory being very different from that.
Right, so different approaches to teaching, different approaches to rehearsal being so important for procedural memory, repetition, but connecting the meaning being so much more important in the case of declarative memory.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. And that's where our emotions come in place. But even when we're talking about procedural memory and going through the process of, with the little biddies that's going to be lining up in the halls to go to the cafeteria, those types of procedures, there's still a lot of affect that's really connected to those. Both of them will have that. But that declarative memory, of course, has the different kinds of connections that are used to be able to practice. I declare I know what a noun is. You can do that. You can write the definition. But so that is a different kind of learning. But the brain is, regardless of the kind, it's always looking for a hook to make a greater meaning into the new things that come into its attention span.
Tammy, are there some, since we know that this may prompt some teachers and administrators to want to learn some more for themselves and to start to dispel some of those neuromyths, do you have, 2, 3, 4, short list of books that you would recommend that you think are particularly helpful in this area?
I think there are some really great books out there. Am I still on, is it my desktop still being shared?
No, it isn't.
Yeah, because I did have 2 slides that had some references on there. But I'd be glad to share those if people have a concern. I don't mind sharing that at all. Pat Wolf is an absolutely amazing person when it comes to being a leader in how we change things into the classroom. When we talk about how we make connections with teaching in the human brain, Kane and Kane just really established the setting there for us to be able, the stage for us, I guess you could say. Even though it's almost been 20 years now, Kane and Kane are amazing. Howard Gardner is a great person. He works with mind-brain education. It is a great publication that comes out. There's some work on my reference list by Eric Jensen, Judy Willis.
And you mentioned Robert Marzano earlier.
And Marzano, for sure. Absolutely. Great people out there that have lots to teach us all about neuroeducation. The Dana Center is also doing some really good work. Charles A. Dana.
www.dana.org.
That is correct.
I happen to know that one off the top of my head.
That's
it's a right. Very helpful one.
Absolutely, it is.
Are there other questions, Sarah, or shall I?
The only other one you just answered.
Okay.
Okay. Tammy, we had some questions when people were registering that I thought were very interesting and provocative. Some of them had to do actually with not so much what the teachers are doing, but looking at it from the student point of view, and either students that had slow processing or were struggling to read, or struggling just in general academically. And some of the questions also related to brain training tools. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on that and what the research tells you in that area?
Yes, I can, because I did do an extensive part of my research with many of the tools that are out there. I think that it's imperative whenever choosing a tool that you do look to see if there is peer-reviewed research. There is an abundance of programs out there which have no research to back it up, and they just are able to sell. And the commercialism that's going on in the world of brain-compatible learning can be very disparaging when you invest in it. It doesn't make a difference. I think it's important that you have something that has what I call my BRAINS in it. You need to have something that starts out with a low level and absolutely always builds those neural connections. You have to have the repeating. You have to have the practice. You have to have the revision type thing. And you also have to have the inquiry and the affect and some novelty in there. See, the thing that's going to make a difference is that you have to be able to have something that pushes the students. And reluctant learners sometimes do not like to be pushed. And so that's where the adult interactions are going to have to take place. We have got to make sure that when students are doing things, first of all, they're not spending their time on brain-based commercial products that do not have peer research, and secondly, that they are using them appropriately so that they can continue to grow from them. There sometimes is resistance with hesitant learners, but all of a sudden, when they get to that epiphany of they get it, there's no stopping them. That is an actual reward. That is not, an actual source of pride. It is not a reward. And so I think it's really important for us to really make sure when we're looking at those that there is some scientific scrutiny, I think, as you will, that they actually are improving some memory capacity, and they're not using pseudoscience to be able to, just perpetuate some kind of a fitness type function.
Are there any programs that you would recommend or not recommend?
Well, there are some, I think. I know in my dissertation I did name some based on other people's research, but I'm not going to not recommend some at this point. I feel a little uncomfortable, but I know that I've had students work with your product, Brainware Safari, and there's just no explaining the difference I've seen in the cognitive ability. There are other things students need to learn. They need their social skills. They need their interactions with the curriculum. But that cognitive piece that connects with neuroscience in a neuroscience-supported way has just been imperative. It's just been astronomical what I've seen. And I've been to many different schools that have been using that program. Just for a conflict of interest, I didn't put it into my dissertation, but I will tell you the many schools that I've been to that use it, they see such jumps in their cognitive abilities. And the thing about this product also is there is sound, peer-reviewed research behind it that supports the neurological, cognitive, educational pedagogy that all connect to make it neuroeducationally valid.
Wonderful. Do we have we had another very interesting question, and it's sort of related to that. And you also do a lot about reading, and the question was really whether, because reading problems are so common and so difficult to correct, is that, and this person was speculating that perhaps the reading field has the wrong idea about how to fix those problems, and really thinking about if the brain is plastic and capable of modifications, then you'd think that we would maybe be able to find some ways to really fix those problems. But we still have, as we know, lots of students reading below basic, and despite all the efforts to do it. So, wondered if you might want to just make a quick comment on that.
Yeah, and sadly, I see this through two lenses. First of all, my personal opinion on this is who decided what second grade was? Who decided what fifth grade level was? I'm not so sure how those things have been put into place, but sometimes I think that our expectations don't necessarily align with the development of the brain as far as the logical prefrontal cortex. I think another thing that we have to realize too is we don't know the answers, because I promise if I knew the answer, I'd be calling all my close friends together and we would just be putting it together and making $1 million. The brains are all different. We're trying many things through history, but we know what doesn't work. And, with all due respect, we're finding that Head Start doesn't seem to be producing the changes that we expected it to make. We're finding, we've swung the pendulum from whole language to phonics and reading first and all these different programs. We're not finding a difference. My question would be, is our expectation, first of all, developmentally appropriate? And although I can't do anything about that, and yes, some students do learn to read above, we know that there's always going to be a spectrum of learners. It's one of the hard realities the world of education is having to deal with right now, and it just kind of breaks my heart that there are some students who at such a young age already feel like they're not successful academically. There's not much tolerance of not being on the right page at the right time in life, like the brain needs. That's kind of my spin on it. I wish I knew what was best. But the reading brain really needs it. Yeah, the reading brain really needs to develop. It is not innate for our brain to read. We've been reading such a small amount of history. If you really think about it, 200 years ago, most people couldn't read. I have a great-grandfather who could not read or write. Education is a very new thing in our development as a society. Most of the world can't read. And so we have very high expectations, which is great. I support that. But I also have to share that the brain does not do this innately. And so we're asking it to do something that's very difficult. And so it will develop at different times as needs arise.
And also recognizing that we need to understand perhaps those processes, those neurological processes that are happening, and fit our instruction a little bit more closely to what the brain needs to be able to develop those particular skills.
Yes, that's really true. And, there's a lot that's even out of the control of classroom teachers, the nutrition, the stress, the world that teachers have no control over. But, you can go into some elementary schools and there are so many decorations around the room. It is so busy. It distracts from the students. It can create some insecurities, and it's really difficult to work and learn at a high level if you don't have the comfort that's needed.
Right. Well, we have reached our stopping time. I'm sure we could talk about these things for many hours, but the insights from your research are really exciting. I would say exciting and also concerning, but certainly gives us sort of a call to action, perhaps, and some good reasons to keep talking about this topic. So,
absolutely.
Tammy, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wonderful research with us. And we hope that everybody on here will join us for another Neuroscience and Education webinar. And we will be sending out copies of the presentation. Tammy has been generous enough to agree to share them. And we'll also be posting the recording of the webinar within the next few days. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.